They planned to kill a war veteran on a family trip, but what they never expected was that his battlefield instincts would save him 30,000 feet above the ocean. The boarding gate smelled of jet fuel and anticipation. I was heading to Miami with my son Christopher and his wife, Edith. It was supposed to be a simple family vacation. The kind retired soldiers take to prove they can still laugh, still live, still belong somewhere. But even after 20 years out of uniform, a veteran's senses never retire. We still listen for what others ignore: the tremor in a voice, the rhythm of footsteps, the silence before danger. The aircraft cabin was cold, humming with the recycled breath of 200 strangers. Christopher and Edith sat ahead of me, whispering in their seats. I caught fragments: altitude, insurance, relax, harmless words to anyone else. But to a man who spent half his life reading coded radio chatter, even small patterns mean something. As I stowed my small carry-on under the seat, I remembered the reason I kept it close. My medication, personal documents, and an old military dog tag rested inside a habit from deployment days when the essentials always stayed within arm's reach. The intercom crackled. A flight attendant named Mildred smiled politely as passengers buckled in. I returned her nod. Something about her eyes caught me alert, scanning, uneasy. She moved down the aisle checking seatbelts, but when she reached me, her professional expression fractured for a heartbeat. She bent slightly, pretending to adjust my shoulder strap. Her voice dropped to a whisper only a trained ear could catch. "Sir, pretend you feel sick. Get off this plane, please." My first thought was that I misheard her. I leaned closer. "Excuse me." Her pupils dilated with genuine fear. "Please, I am begging you." Her tone had that clipped urgency I remembered from battlefield medics, controlled but terrified. Then she was gone, moving back toward the galley like nothing had happened. For a moment, I sat frozen, heart pounding. The rational part of my mind listed possibilities: wrong passenger, internal security drill, mistaken identity. But my instincts, the ones that kept me alive through 2 tours overseas, were screaming something else. Ahead of me, Christopher leaned toward Edith. Their faces were close, their smiles too rehearsed. She checked her phone, typed something quickly, then turned the screen away from me. He nodded once, mechanical, like following orders. I felt the cabin walls closing in. The recycled air suddenly carried the metallic tang of threat. My throat went dry. I loosened my collar and pressed the call button. Mildred appeared instantly, as if she had been waiting. "Yes, sir," she said aloud, but her eyes told another story. I think I'm not feeling well," I said, hand over my chest. She caught my cue with soldierly precision. "Understood, sir. Let's get you checked." Within seconds, another attendant joined her. The tone shifted, urgent but calm. Passengers watched as they helped me stand, one arm over each shoulder. Edith turned, her eyes wide but not with concern, with frustration. Christopher rose halfway from his seat before Edith's hand pulled him back. That tiny gesture confirmed everything my gut already knew. They wheeled me through the narrow aisle as the captain's voice echoed overhead. "Medical situation, temporary delay." The words blurred into the background noise of my pulse hammering in my ears. I caught one final glance at my son's face. No panic, no worry, only cold calculation. Inside the terminal, paramedics met us near Gate 41. My vitals were fine. Mildred lingered nearby, hands trembling slightly. When the medical team left, she knelt beside me, voice barely audible. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "please do not get back on that plane." "How do you know my name?" I asked quietly. Her eyes darted toward the window where the aircraft waited, jet bridge still attached. "Because I heard your daughter-in-law in the restroom. I heard what she planned." My stomach clenched. "What did she plan?" She swallowed hard. "She said you would die in flight, that altitude would make it look natural, that your insurance would pay $500,000. I recorded it. I stared at her, the world tilting. A veteran's mind organizes chaos, automatically objectives, threats, contingencies, but this was family, not enemy. My son, my own blood, sitting calmly on that aircraft, waiting for a headline that would label me as another elderly passenger who didn't make it. Through the terminal window, I watched the plane door close. The jet pushed back, engines roaring. Every vibration trembled through the glass. Christopher and Edith were inside, unaware that their operation had failed. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Mildred's whisper repeated in my head like a field radio transmission. "Pretend you are sick. Get off the plane." I realized then that I had not escaped danger by luck. I had followed an order from the only person who had truly seen what was happening. The plane began its takeoff roll. I felt the tremor through the floor, watched it lift into the gray sky, carrying my betrayal away at 500 miles per hour. But a soldier never watches a threat disappear without preparing for its return. I looked at Mildred, who still stood beside me, pale and shaken. "You said you recorded it?" She nodded. "Yes, I can show you, but not here." The roar of the departing plane faded, replaced by the distant hum of airport announcements and the soft hiss of recycled air. I straightened in the wheelchair, the posture of command returning automatically. "Then let's find somewhere private," I said. Because if what she claimed was true, this was no longer a family trip. It was an ambush, and I was the only one who knew the trap had already been sprung. They say, a soldier's curse is that peace feels unnatural. My house was proof of that quiet. Too quiet, like the seconds before incoming fire. Sunlight cut through dusty blinds, glinting off metals that hadn't seen daylight in years. My discharge certificate hung above the desk, yellowed and proud, surrounded by silence that weighed more than body armor. Christopher and Edith had been living here for 8 months, moving like polite strangers through rooms I once called home. They spoke to me the way people speak to monuments, respectful, distant, waiting for the day the stone cracks. That evening, while I polished my old boots ritual, not vanity, the door opened downstairs. Their footsteps climbed the stairs with forced cheer. Edith led, sweet smile stretched too wide. "Dad, we've been thinking about family," she said, easing into my room as if testing enemy ground. Christopher stood behind her, avoiding eye contact, his hands buried in his pockets like he was hiding guilt instead of coins. "A trip," Edith continued, voice bright. "To Miami. Just the 3 of us. Like old times." I looked at my son. "You hated Miami when you were 12. You said the ocean smelled like fuel." He laughed nervously. "That was then. I see things differently now." Edith perched on the arm of my chair, the scent of her perfume too sharp, too practiced. "Everything's booked," she said. "Next week. Just say yes." I felt the room shrink. Their smiles were synchronized, rehearsed like soldiers briefing a superior. "All right," I said finally, watching their eyes flash with quick relief. "If it means that much." That night she cooked dinner a first. Christopher poured wine with shaking hands, asking too many questions about my medication. When Edith mentioned my life insurance, $500,000, she said casually the fork slipped in my hand. I asked how she knew. She smiled. "Chris told me." I looked at my son, and for the first time, I saw not blood, but motive. Hours later, the house was quiet again. They'd gone to bed, leaving printed flight confirmations on the table. My name, the destination, the date Tuesday, 0700 hours. It was already done. They didn't need my consent, only my body. I stood there in the kitchen light, heart steady, mind colder than it had been in years. Whatever this was, it wasn't a vacation. It was an operation. And I was the target they thought wouldn't fight back. I spent the next morning pretending everything was normal. Just like in combat, you learn to look calm even when you smell the fuse burning. The house carried that strange domestic peace that hides tension underneath, like the quiet before artillery. Edith was humming in the kitchen, cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed. Christopher was reading the newspaper upside down, trying too hard to act casual. When he saw me, he folded it quickly. "Morning, Dad. Slept okay?" he asked. I nodded, studying the way his hands trembled slightly. Hands that once built model planes with me now shook like he was holding a live grenade. "Miami's going to be great," he said, forcing excitement. "You'll love the hotel, right on the water." I asked which hotel. He hesitated a fraction too long. "Edith's got all the details," he said. She turned, spatula in hand, smiling too widely. "Yes, everything's arranged. You just need to show up." I caught the flicker of relief when I didn't question further. A soldier knows that look, it's the face of someone whose plan depends on your silence. I poured coffee slowly, the sound of it filling the kitchen. "Strange," I said casually. "I don't remember giving you my ID for booking." Edith didn't flinch. "Oh, Christopher handled it. Family accounts, remember?" She said it like a statement, not a question. I didn't answer. The bitterness of the coffee grounded me. In war, the best defense is patience. You let the enemy reveal their position. That afternoon, I opened my study drawer and pulled out my small black notebook, the one I used during my last deployment. Every operation began with a log. I dated the top. Operation Miami. Beneath it, I wrote the first entry. Subject behavior inconsistent with stated purpose. Objective unknown. Motive suspected. Financial. My handwriting was slow, deliberate, just like I had trained younger soldiers record everything, especially the details that feel unimportant. That night, while they watched television downstairs, I quietly inspected my documents. My insurance policy sat inside a folder labeled, "For emergency only." I checked it carefully. The beneficiary line had been changed. My niece's name was gone, replaced by Christopher Wilson. The signature beside it looked like mine, but the slant was wrong, the loops too high, the pressure uneven. Forged. Cleanly done. But forged. I sat there in silence, the weight of that discovery pressing against my chest heavier than any rucksack I had carried in the field. They had already rewritten my legacy on paper. All that remained was to erase the man himself. I took a deep breath, the kind you take before pulling a trigger. When I walked downstairs later, they were laughing louder than usual, forced. Edith's wineglass was full. Christopher's eyes followed me across the room, searching my face for signs of suspicion. I gave him none. "Early flight, right?" I asked. He nodded quickly. 0700 hours. We'll leave by 0430 to be safe. I smiled. "Good. I'll pack light." As I climbed back up the stairs, their voices dropped to whispers. I heard my name. Then the phrase, "smooth and painless." It was said the same way officers discuss a target detached. Efficient. Inevitable. I closed my bedroom door quietly, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the small photo of Christopher as a boy gap-toothed, proud, wearing my oversized cap. I'd taught him to shoot, to fish, to never lie. But he had learned something darker on his own. I began packing that night, not for vacation, but for evidence. Each item went into the carry-on. Medication, identification, and a miniature camera disguised as a keychain. Old habits die hard. Soldiers don't walk into unknown territory without reconnaissance. When the suitcase clicked shut, I felt the decision settle in my chest. Yes, I would go to Miami. I would sit beside them. I would smile when they smiled. And I would find out exactly how far they were willing to go. Because in every operation, the mission doesn't end when you're targeted, it begins. By the morning of departure, I had already shifted into mission mode. Everything I did, how I moved, how I spoke, was deliberate. A soldier learns that survival is 90% observation and 10% timing. I woke before dawn, dressed in plain clothes, and double-checked my bag. Every essential medications, passport, keychain camera, notebook was inside my carry-on. Never trust checked luggage. That rule had saved my life once in Afghanistan when an IED was hidden in the wrong truck. Today, it might save me again. Christopher's car pulled up at exactly 0430 hours. The trunk was open, but inside was nearly empty. "No space for your suitcase, Dad," he said, smiling too quickly. "Just hold it on your lap. It's a short ride." I looked at the empty trunk, then at him, but said nothing. He relaxed. Edith sat in the front passenger seat, her perfume heavy enough to choke the air. She kept typing on her phone, deleting each message after sending. My son drove fast, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The city still slept. Neon gas stations flickered past, strip malls silent under orange streetlights. I knew every block of this road, the one leading to Orlando International Airport, like I knew every convoy route overseas. The same rhythm, the same tension. Every light, every sound, every movement mattered. Edith broke the silence first. "You excited, Francis? Warm beaches, family time, all of us together again." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes in the side mirror were steel. I nodded slowly. Of course, nothing like family. They laughed softly. To anyone else, it might sound like affection. To me, it sounded like pre-operation nerves. Christopher turned the radio on, then off. Couldn't decide between noise or quiet. Edith's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, smiled faintly, then locked it. I caught the reflection of her grin in the window, satisfied, confident. When we reached the airport, Christopher parked in short-term parking, the most expensive option. "Just quicker," he said. "Lies again. We were leaving for a week." I noticed every inconsistency, every choice made not from logic but from anxiety. Inside the terminal, Edith guided me forward, her hand firm on my shoulder like she was afraid I might bolt. Her voice softened when others were near, cheerful for the crowd. At security, I placed my carry-on on the conveyor belt. As it rolled through the X-ray, I watched Edith lean toward the screen, her eyes narrowing. She relaxed only when my bag emerged intact. The relief was too visible to be coincidence. That was when I knew something in that bag mattered to her more than to me. Maybe she'd planned to tamper with it. Maybe she thought I'd left something vulnerable inside. We reached the gate. Christopher's tickets placed them in Zone 1, mine, Zone 3. "Boarding order," he said casually. "We'll grab your seat." They walked ahead when the first call came, disappearing down the jetway without a backward glance. I stood there with my boarding pass in hand, heart steady, mind sharp. The sound of engines humming beyond the window felt like a countdown. When my group was finally called, I stepped forward, scanning the faces of the crew. That's when I saw her again, Mildred, the same flight attendant from the day before, her expression frozen halfway between duty and dread. She checked my boarding pass, then leaned close, whispering, "Please, sir, not again. You have to leave this flight." The world seemed to narrow. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Because I heard more," she said, voice trembling. "Please, trust me." Her eyes darted toward Christopher and Edith, already seated 3 rows ahead, their heads bent together. I saw the moment she realized I was hesitating, her professional mask cracked completely. "Please," she whispered again, almost breaking. "They mean to finish what they started." That was all I needed. Instinct took over, the same instinct that had pulled me out of ambushes. The same one that told me when to run and when to fight. I clutched my chest, staggered into the aisle, gasping for air. My voice rasped. My heart. The reaction was immediate. Flight crew rushed in. Medical calls echoed. Passengers gasped. Christopher's face twisted, not in panic, but fury. Edith froze, her knuckles white around her phone. Within moments, the attendants had me in a wheelchair, rushing me back through the jetway. I didn't resist. I let the performance carry me away from whatever waited in that cabin. As they rolled me into the terminal, Mildred's face reappeared beside me, pale under fluorescent light. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Through the glass wall, I could see the aircraft taxiing away. 2 silhouettes near the window, Christopher and Edith watched in silence as the plane moved. I couldn't hear them, but I could read their lips. Edith's words were clear. "This ruins everything." I watched the plane drift toward the runway, a silver shape carrying my own blood, my own betrayal. Soldiers are trained never to turn their back on a threat until it's neutralized. I wasn't done with them. Not yet. The medical room smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, the kind of sterile quiet that presses against your thoughts until you can hear your own heartbeat. A paramedic had already cleared me, vitals steady, no heart issue, no reason to worry. But worry wasn't the problem. Trust was. Through the narrow glass window, I watched the tail of the aircraft glide down the runway, carrying my son and daughter-in-law toward Miami. The thought hit me harder than any explosion I'd heard overseas. My family was gone, and they had tried to take me with them. I sat on the edge of the examination table, my hands steady on my knees, waiting. Every mission teaches you patience. You never rush after you've survived an ambush. The door creaked open. Mildred entered, still in uniform, her face pale and tight. She looked around once, made sure we were alone, and shut the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. She took out her phone with shaking hands, thumb hovering over the screen. "What I'm about to show you could cost me my job, but I can't let this happen again." She opened her video library and pressed play. The audio was rough, but I knew that voice immediately. Edith. Calm, efficient, cold. "The pills dissolve fast. He won't taste anything. Altitude makes it look natural. Heart failure at 30,000 feet, no clear evidence." There was a pause, then laughter. $500,000, she said softly, almost with admiration. "Christopher's nervous, but he'll do it." The sound of that laughter echoed in my chest. I had heard laughter like that before in interrogation rooms. When someone thought they'd won, I asked quietly, "Who was she talking to?" Mildred shook her head. "I don't know. She said something about the plan being in motion." She left the restroom right after. I took the phone, watched the footage twice, then a third time. The more I listened, the less it felt real. That voice, so polite at dinner, so warm in conversation, was now the voice of a killer planning an execution in broad daylight. When the video ended, I sat still, eyes fixed on the frozen frame of Edith's reflection in the mirror. A soldier's mind compartmentalizes trauma. You don't feel until you're safe. But there, under the fluorescent light, I finally understood the new battlefield, my own home. I looked up at Mildred. "Why did you record it?" She hesitated. "Because 3 years ago, my father trusted someone like that. His nephew convinced him to change his will. 2 months later, he fell down the stairs. Police called it an accident. I never proved otherwise." Her jaw clenched. When I heard her voice, I couldn't ignore it. I won't lose another father. There was something in her tone, raw, honest, that reminded me of soldiers who carried ghosts from old missions. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my notebook, the same one labeled Operation Miami. I wrote down her name, contact number, time, and date. "This is now part of the record," I said. Old habits die hard. Documentation saves lives. She gave a faint smile. You sound like an investigator. I met her eyes. 40 years of military intelligence leaves a mark. She nodded slowly. Then you'll know what to do next. When she left, I remained seated for a long while. The airport outside was bustling, families laughing, children running, planes taking off like clockwork. And in that noise, I found clarity. My son had planned my death for money. His wife had drawn the blueprint. They had lived in my house, eaten my food, and plotted my end. That wasn't betrayal. That was war. The first rule of survival is simple. Accept reality before it kills you. I accepted it fully. I called a cab, gave the driver my address, and stared out the window during the 40-minute ride home. Orlando blurred by in-streaks of color and motion, but my mind was crystal clear. Every sign, every word, every gesture from the past months now had new meaning. The late-night whispers, the sudden generosity, the fake concern for my health. All puzzle pieces falling into place. When I reached the house, I unlocked the door and stepped into what now felt like enemy territory. The kitchen light flickered faintly, reflecting off the table where I'd once eaten with my family. That same table now waited for evidence. I placed my notebook on it, opened to a clean page, and wrote across the top, Phase 2, Counterintelligence. Beneath it, I wrote the mission objective. Expose the conspiracy. Neutralize without violence. Record everything. The night deepened. The house was still. I walked into my study, turned on the lamp, and pulled out my files, insurance, medical, bank. I spread them across the table in formation. A battlefield of paper and ink. Each document was a soldier in the war for truth. Somewhere in those pages was the proof that would destroy their plan. When the clock hit 2300 hours, I found it the insurance form. Forged. Beneficiary switched. My signature faked. I traced the curve of the F in Francis. Too smooth. Not mine. They had copied me, but not perfectly. That flaw was my weapon. Outside, wind moved through the trees. The sound reminded me of a patrol night long ago, when the jungle whispered warnings before the attack. I stood at the window, the neighborhood asleep, the moon pale over the quiet street. The enemy this time was not foreign. It was blood. I closed the curtains and wrote the final note for the night. They think the mission failed. They don't know it's only begun. Mildred's hands trembled when she handed me the phone, but her voice steadied as if rehearsed for this moment. She told me about her father first, because there is always a reason people cross a line and then cannot live with what they have done. She described how her father had trusted a relative, how a signature had been changed, how an accident had been declared, and how that unpaid sorrow sat like shrapnel in her chest for years. When she heard Edith's voice in the restroom, planning a death as if it were a transaction, she said she could not let another family go through that slow burn of grief. I listened the way we were trained to listen in the field, careful, detached enough to take notes, close enough to understand motive, because who else would catalog the truth if not someone who had been taught to notice patterns that others dismiss as coincidence? She played the clip again and again. The restroom tiles gave a hollow echo that made the words sharper. The pills dissolve fast, Edith said in a calm, professional tone. Altitude makes it look natural. No autopsy, $500,000. And then laughter followed like a soft, obscene punctuation. Each phrase landed on me like a sequence of commands that spelled out premeditation. Years of reading after action reports taught me to hear the structure of a plan, and this one had a logistics section and a payout clause. When I asked whether the clip had a date stamp, she told me it did not, but the time on her phone placed it in the early afternoon, which matched the window when our gate had been busiest and surveillance was at its lowest. She explained how she had recorded it an accident of duty, she said. She had stepped into the restroom to check the time, overheard Edith's conversation, held her thumb over the record button because something in her memory warned her that a voice promising to profit from another man's death could not be ignored. Her fear was practical. Losing the recording could mean losing the only leverage against a well-practiced plan. She had preserved the file in 3 encrypted locations, and she handed me the phone numbers and the passwords scribbled on the back of a napkin as if those paper scraps were field maps. Each line a route to safety. Mildred was not a hero because she recorded a phone clip. She was a hero because she turned her memory into a sworn commitment and she was willing to stand in court and speak if necessary. She told me she had already suffered the small social cost of being wrong once before. A community that calls you vengeful when you insist on truth. So she had taken precautions. She had copied the file to a secure cloud, emailed a copy to a trusted friend, and prepared a chain of custody that could survive skeptics and cynics. I felt the soldier in me recognize that thoroughness. If you expect to build a case, you do not rely on one witness or one memory. You create redundancy, like backup radios in a convoy. We left the medical room with a plan that smelled faintly of midnight briefings. We would not involve the police immediately because a premature call would flush the predators and let them scatter, but we also could not sit idle and let them finish their job on a plane over the Atlantic Ocean. I told Mildred about my small notebook, the one I used to log observations, and she agreed to hand me everything she had, including metadata and the time she had saved the clip. She also agreed to testify if required. Her eyes held the kind of resolve that comes from exposure to injustice early, and often people who become guardians because the system failed them once. Back home, the house felt different. The worn hallway, the picture of Christopher as a boy, the mantle with a small folded flag that traveled with me from deployments, all of it turned into a map of motives. I laid out documents the way I had once laid maps across a Humvee hood. Insurance policies, bank statements, past wills, any paper that could be turned into evidence. The forged beneficiary change was the first obvious strike my niece's name erased. Christopher's typed in, a signature that tried to imitate my hand but lacked the small, careless flourish I used when I was tired. That flourish was a detail forged like a crude camouflage patch. It betrayed confidence in technique but not in knowledge. I annotated everything with military clarity dates written in full, entries catalogued as Exhibit 1, 2, and so forth, each file labeled with who had access and when. In the margins, I wrote my rules of engagement. No violence, no confrontation. Preserve the chain of custody. Document every interaction. And make sure the public record would be indisputable. The rules of engagement had served me overseas. Now they were repurposed for the home front because the enemy wore my son's face and my daughter-in-law's smile. Writing those rules calmed me. Paperwork steadied me the way ritual did for men in foxholes. I spent the night pulling digital threads, emails, deleted messages, and the shadow trails people leave when they think they are private. Christopher had left a laptop in his room. Years of being the man who fixed neighbors' printers had taught me a few ways to recover files. I did not crack passwords like a criminal. I used the simple fact that he had never changed the default login because he was careless with time and attention, accustomed to buying quick solutions rather than building lasting ones. Within an hour, I had resurrected deleted drafts, old calendars, and a cluster of suspicious appointment entries that mentioned consultation and delivery with vague times entries that, after Mildred's clip, sounded like steps in a grim supply chain. When I found emails referencing an unnamed consultant and a line about making it look natural at altitude, something cold settled under my ribs. I did what any veteran would. I marked the most actionable items, photographed documents for redundancy, and uploaded copies to a secure server under an innocuous folder name. Then I wrote the next line in my notebook. Phase 3 legal engagement. I called Nicholas Clark, a lawyer I had found through a former platoon mate who swore he could read a legal battlefield as well as any colonel. Nicholas answered on the first ring, and after I explained in terse, factual sentences, he agreed to help immediately and asked me to bring everything to his office at 2 in the afternoon. Before I hung up, Mildred messaged me. Be careful. They are closer than you think. Her words landed like a warning flare. I checked the locks again, the same way a soldier checks gear before a mission methodical. Twice. 3 times. I set up a cheap home camera over the dining table disguised as a smoke detector because I had learned that surveillance could be passive and legal, and that evidence collected legally is stronger in court than eyewitness reports. Then I waited, which felt like the longest part of any operation. Waiting is an instrument. It forces those who have something to hide to act, and they will show their hand with sloppy certainty. I had time to prepare, but not to be indulgent. The recording existed, the forged papers existed, and Mildred existed as a witness who had already made choices. Now I had to bind these threads into a case that the law could understand, one that would not only protect me, but would also hold the betrayers accountable. Outside, the night sounded perfectly ordinary. A distant lawnmower, the rustle of trees, a neighbor's television murmuring. Inside, I reviewed the clip again and again until the cadence of Edith's laughter stopped being a mystery and started to feel like an address. I wrote the final line of that night's log. Do not rush the strike. Force them to commit more of themselves. They will reveal their methods if we are patient. Then I turned out the light and let the darkness do what it does, best hide the plans of the foolish until their own speed betrays them. I walked in the front door like a man returning to barracks after a long patrol, boots echoing on familiar floorboards, senses sharpened by a night of listening and thinking. The house felt unnatural under the same light I had left it in, too quiet, as if the walls were holding their breath for what I would do next. I set my carry-on down by the stairs and went straight to my study because soldiers always bring the fight to a planning room, not to the kitchen where emotions rule. There, with a lamp low and a coffee gone cold beside me, I spread the papers out like a squadron map, arranging insurance forms, bank statements, the forged beneficiary, and the power of attorney that smelled of someone else's confidence. Each document had the potential to be either camouflage or exposure, and I treated them the way I had once treated intelligence briefs. Every crease, every stamp, every margin note mattered. The forged beneficiary change was Exhibit 1, in the way my hands found it, turned it over like a veteran checking a weapon for defects. My niece's name was gone, and Christopher's had been substituted in clean type. The signature at the bottom attempted to mimic my flourish, but there was an awkward, clinical precision to it that betrayed a hand that had practiced copying rather than a hand that had lived the trials of decades. I compared the loop on the capital F with other documents I had signed, house closing papers, veteran benefits, forms, the old will stored in the bank safe, and the difference was obvious. The forger had forged technique, not character, and in that slippage lay proof. A veteran learns to detect discrepancies the way others learn to spot a lie in a smile, and this signature was a lie with a shaky hand. Bank statements revealed a slow drip of small transfers, amounts cunningly modest so they would not trigger alarm bells, 300 here, 500 there, totaling $38,000 over 6 months, disguised as family loans and help with bills. The pattern was classic. Start with small extractions, then increase frequency as the thief grows bolder. Someone who had read after-action reports as often as I had learned to see patterns like this. People do the same bad thing repeatedly until evidence compels them to stop. I printed every page, stamped dates in full, and then photographed each sheet to create redundant records. Redundancy was my form of tactical patience. Next, I pulled the power of attorney document and read it as if it were enemy propaganda. The language was legal, the notarization looked official at first glance, but the notary stamp led to a nameless address and a signature that did not match the official seal on the notary's registry. That registry gave me a trail, a name to cross-check, and a fake to expose. For every forged paper, there was a trail of footsteps. For every altered file, there was a careless erasure. And where erasures existed, the desperate leave fingerprints. I highlighted the forged entries, wrote notes on margins and block letters, and dated each notation in long form, the month, the day, the year. If the courtroom required days on paper, I would give the days with a soldier's insistence on precision. Then I moved to the digital sphere and treated Christopher's abandoned laptop like a field radio that might reveal an emitter. He had left it open on his desk more times than not. Laziness had been his privacy weakness. I took it to my study, booted it up, and used the simple user accounts he had carelessly left in defaults. Deleted drafts resurrected themselves like ghosts when the right search terms were called. Hidden emails breathed back to life under keyword pressure. I found a string of messages to a contact labeled consultant, and a message that chilled me. Altitude makes it believable. Emergency at 30,000 feet limits investigation. 10,000 for consultation plus supply. The language was transactional and practiced, as if the author had field-tested euphemisms for murder. I printed those emails, copied them to a secure external drive in triplicate, and uploaded encrypted backups to cloud storage under a generic folder name that would not attract attention. Everything I recorded and copied, I cataloged in my notebook with military neatness. Exhibit 2 bank transfers. Exhibit 3 emails to consultant. Exhibit 4 forged power of attorney. Exhibit 5 beneficiary change. Each item got a number, a short description, the source, and a note about chain of custody. It was tedious work, the kind of work that bored men in battle to tears but later saved lives when commanders needed proof that an ambush had been premeditated. My hands moved through the motions with the calm of routine, and the slow ritual of cataloging turned a panic into a plan. I also began to reconstruct motive by gathering context. Christopher's mounting debt to bookmakers and online betting accounts, messages indicating desperation, a pattern of borrowing that increased as the transfers from my accounts decreased. Edith's access to administrative systems at Silver Palms Medical Center, where patient templates and forms could be repurposed to manufacture records. The professional capability and the personal need had intersected to form motive, and motive connected to method. Where motive and method intersect is where law and morality meet, and I intended to place my evidence squarely at the crossroads. Having assembled the material, I now assessed options like a commander, evaluating courses of action. Immediate arrest through local police risked alerting them and causing flight. Immediate public exposure could trigger panic and destroy the fragile chain of evidence I had built. Immediate confrontation could be dangerous because desperation breeds violence. The veteran in me decided upon the most surgical approach: build an airtight legal case first. A prosecutor armed with irrefutable documentation and credible witnesses could deliver an outcome that was more permanent than a quick arrest. The plan would be to neutralize the enemy legally, to strip them of resources and credibility so their options would collapse one by one. I called Nicholas Clark and spoke in short, efficient sentences. I handed over the exhibits and asked him to review everything with war room thoroughness. He arrived with a briefcase and a steady look, and within minutes, he started mapping legal avenues. Forensic document analysis for signatures, a forensic audit of bank transfers, preservation notices to financial institutions, subpoenas for call logs, and an understanding that Mildred's recording had to be secured with a clear chain of custody. Nicholas and I discussed courtroom choreography, laying paper trails, preserving digital backups, and staging witness statements. He agreed that we must move deliberately, quietly, and with legal precision. Before Nicholas left, we set rules. Do not confront Christopher or Edith. Do not change anything in the house that could be challenged as tampering. Maintain surveillance, and prepare for their reactions. We would not panic them into mistakes that destroyed evidence. Instead, we would trap them with their own confidence. If they thought they were near success, they would commit more errors to cement their gains. Desperate actors escalate, and in their escalation, they leave new, incriminating traces. Patience, again, was weaponized. That evening, I installed a few more lawful surveillance devices in plain sight, told the technician to ensure audio recording and to upload to cloud servers with two-factor authentication, and then sat down at the dining table, surrounded by the proofs of betrayal. I allowed myself to feel the small, bitter grief for the son I once knew. Grief is a weapon when tempered, but it must not become blind rage. I dimmed the light, laid out the photos of Christopher as a child beside the evidence, and wrote one final line in my notebook. This will be the last time blood answers blood. We will let law do the striking. Outside, the suburban night hummed the way radio static does before clarity arrives. And inside, the house hummed with evidence that would not allow the truth to be dismissed. I slept for a few hours and woke at dawn with a single, soldier-like thought: prepare the case so thoroughly that mercy would be the only grace left to grant. The mission had changed from survival to justice, and I would execute it with the same discipline I had given to every operation that had mattered. They believed they had already won. I planned to make them watch the tribunal they had manufactured for me turn on them. I called Nicholas Clark like I would call a platoon sergeant when the patrol needed a plan. Short, direct, with no room for hearts to rule decisions. He arrived at 2 p.m. with a briefcase, a steady pair of shoes, and the sort of voice that makes people lower theirs and listen. He had a reputation for turning messy human things into clean legal diagrams. I slid the exhibits across his desk one by one: photocopies, email printouts, photos of forged signatures, bank statements with sums siphoned off in small increments, and watched his face remain practically calm, as though he did not want to make my anger his business. He read like a man who reads maps. Focus on routes, choke points, and exit possibilities. We are looking at a cluster, he said, tapping Exhibit 2 and Exhibit 3 in sequence. Financial exploitation, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder, and elder abuse. The audio from the flight attendant is central, but we must secure chain of custody and corroborate motive with clear documentary and digital evidence. I felt the veteran in me nod. When you want a conviction, you do not bring emotion to courtrooms. You bring ironclad proof and a narrative so simple a jury cannot misread it. Nicholas outlined steps like a tactical brief preservation, notices to the banks to freeze contested transfers, forensic imaging of Christopher's laptop to prevent tampering, a certified copy request for the notary registry, and immediate filing of a preservation subpoena on the cloud accounts where Mildred stored the recording. He spoke of expert witnesses, a forensic document examiner to demonstrate the signature forgery, a certified forensic accountant to map the incremental thefts over time, and a medical professional to testify to the feasibility of drugging someone and having altitude mask the cause of death. Each expert was a specialist weapon in a campaign designed to remove wiggle room from a defense. I do not want them alerted before we have a file strong enough to survive cross-examination, Nicholas said, folding his hands. We will not rush to arrest because arrest could push them to destroy evidence or flee. We will build a case that is airtight, Then we will neutralize their financial channels and file criminal charges. When the prosecutor sees this package, they will not be able to ignore it. He spoke like a man who had seen desperate people make worse choices when cornered. He chose the patient, surgical approach because desperate people panic and reveal additional crimes. We agreed on rules of engagement that sounded more like military directives than legal counsel. Do not confront Christopher or Edith directly. Preserve the house exactly as it is unless absolutely necessary. Create redundant copies of digital files in at least 3 secure offsite locations, and document any interaction with them in full. I was to continue the performance of confusion, while Nicholas moved through legal channels to lock down accounts and subpoena records. The strategy was designed so that their confidence would grow, that they would continue to commit visible acts of theft or tampering, and that every panicked reaction would be another piece of prosecution evidence. Nicholas asked about potential witnesses beyond Mildred. I gave him a list. A neighbor who had seen odd late-night conversations through slightly open windows, a pharmacist who remembered odd queries about obscure medications, and a colleague from a local veterans group who had seen Christopher frantic about money. He nodded and made notes, explaining how witness testimony would be calibrated to match documentary exhibits so that the prosecution could present motive, method, and opportunity as one contiguous story rather than a scatter of grievances. He emphasized that the jury needs a story they can retell to themselves. Facts without a coherent narrative become noise. He also warned me of common defense moves. They may try to paint this as a family misunderstanding, or they may allege you are forgetful and thus unreliable, he said. We will neutralize that by getting a licensed psychiatrist or neurologist to perform a formal cognitive evaluation and testify to your competence. The last thing a jury should see is doubt about your capacity. We will make competence unassailable. The plan felt like a well-worn manual funneling chaos into order, and I felt myself trust the process the same way I had learned to trust a radio operator's cadence when receiving coordinates under fire. Nicholas arranged for a private investigator to begin a discreet background sweep on the unnamed consultant referenced in the emails and the chain of small transfers appearing on my statements. He asked me for access to Christopher's laptop and any passwords I might know, and I handed over every scrap of a memory that might serve the case. He scheduled a meeting with a forensic document examiner and a certified forensic accountant for the next morning, and instructed me to keep a log of every interaction with Christopher and Edith, including times written out in full. He explained the linguistic precision required for deposition testimony, and how even a single slip in phrasing could give defense counsel the rope they needed to hang credibility. Before he left, Nicholas boiled the plan down to a line that sounded like a mission order. We will not arrest in haste. We will not confront in confusion. We will document, secure, and then present. The law moves slower than anger, but when it lands, its reach is permanent. He left me with his card and a list of local contacts. A document examiner, an accountant, and a notary registry clerk he trusted. Outside his office window, the city carried on as if ordinary life could not hold such betrayal. Inside, we had become architects of accountability. After he drove away, I went to the dining table and revisited every document with new eyes, this time annotating legal strategy beside each entry. What to present first in court, what to hold until expert testimony could reinforce it, and which witness statements would best illustrate pattern and intent. I recorded the list of questions Nicholas had asked about the timeline, and I spelled out the likely defense rebuttals so I could prepare to refute them preemptively. The veteran in me appreciated the rhythm, the slow accumulation of advantage until the enemy's options narrow to one ugly choice. That night, I set a simple trap in the house. I authorized the technician to install a visible camera with audio over the dining table while also leaving a concealed recorder inside an old vent where they would not look. The visible camera served as bait. Many culprits assume the presence of surveillance will keep them careful, while a hidden recorder captures what they believe to be private. The legal team would be able to authenticate both sources if chain of custody was properly maintained, and that authentication would make it difficult for defense counsel to dismiss the evidence as tampered. In bed that night, I thought of last week's trip to the airport and the whisper that shifted my life. The whispered plea of a flight attendant had set a cascade in motion. Now it was my task to turn that whisper into an indelible record that could not be ignored. The difference between battlefield improvisation and courtroom patience had to be observed with discipline. I closed my eyes and wrote one final note in my notebook. Make them commit more. Make their greed reveal itself. Law will do the rest. Outside, the night carried on like a routine patrol returning to base. Inside, the house was a map of intent and evidence waiting to be activated. The real battle was no longer about survival at 500 miles per hour. It was about ensuring that those who planned my death would be stripped of every resource and every lie they had built. The trap was set. Now it was time to wait for them to walk into it. I learned early in uniform that the best soldier is the one who disappears into the environment until the right moment to act arrives. For 3 days after Nicholas left my study, I played the role they expected. Forgetful, slow. A man who misplaces his glasses and asks the same question twice. I swallowed the small humiliation like bitter coffee because deception has its uses. Pretending to be less capable lured them into a sense of safety that would make their next moves careless. At breakfast, I fumbled with my spoon and pretended I could not remember the password to my own banking app, and Christopher smiled with the condescension of someone who had already counted the inheritance. I let them see the old man I no longer was and kept the veteran. I still remained hidden behind that mask. Surveillance is both art and discipline. I contracted a legitimate security service under the pretense of worry about break-ins, citing a neighborhood burglary from 2 blocks over and the priors of living alone. The technician arrived with polite professionalism, installed visible cameras above the dining table and in the living room, and explained the package in careful terms like an onboarding briefing. I insisted on audio capture because I knew the difference between a suspicious whisper and a private conversation that would amount to confession. The technician asked about cloud backup and redundancy, and I requested multi-factor authentication, encrypted storage, and off-site duplication, technical precautions a prosecutor would appreciate, and a desperate liar fear. While the visible cameras served as bait, I placed a small concealed recorder inside an old heating vent above the dining room. The same vent where, as a teacher, I had once hidden a tape recorder to catch cheating students. It was a small trick that felt almost ceremonial. At night, I listened to the feeds with headphones, cataloging minutes like a duty roster. They moved through the house with the casual arrogance of people who believed their plan had survived exposure. Edith complained about kitchen layouts, and Christopher complained about work that did not exist, and both laughed like people who think the war is already won. Then, late on a Thursday, footage captured a private conversation in the living room that made my pen stop mid-note. Edith's voice was clinical, crisp, the cadence of someone who gave orders in a hospital and had learned to speak like a minister of efficiency. She said, "Get our documentation in order. We will move to guardianship if the plane fails. Doctors at Silver Palms owe me favors." Christopher answered, voice low, brittle with strain. "I will handle the bank transfers, small amounts. Nobody notices small things." The recorder picked up the names of clinics, the shorthand of procurement, and even a mention of a local notary who would make it look clean. Each fragment was an axe in the tree of their deception, and I saved the clips into 3 separate encrypted folders, stamped with timestamps written out in full, and noted each on my ledger for chain of custody. The performance required craft. I missed a medication dose in front of them, appeared confused about a billing statement, and left my wallet on the kitchen table while I shuffled through old photographs, a feigned distraction that drew Edith to comment on my supposed inability to manage money. They took the bait and spoke of contingency plans over wine, as if I were a broken radio in the next room present but inaudible. My heart tightened each time I heard Christopher suggest more aggressive steps, a plan that sounded like a logistics meeting rather than a family argument. I recorded everything. The hidden microphone captured details the visible cameras could not, the small, sharp syllables of planning that people make when they believe they are anonymous. I rehearsed plausible confusion for the inevitable visits to banks and clinics. When Christopher called to ask if I trusted his friend to help with paperwork, I hesitated, blinked slowly, and said, "Well, the memory has been a bit foggy lately." He offered to bring the forms over the next day, and I pretended relief. The trick was consistency. My acts of forgetfulness had to be believable without being so extreme that a court would later question my competence. Therefore, I sought a formal cognitive evaluation from a reputable professional before the guardianship gambit could be deployed. Dr. Patricia Chen conducted a battery of tests, asked questions in a tone that made me feel the dull buzz of exam rooms, and recorded her finding in writing: full competency, no cognitive impairment, and sharp memory for dates, events, and procedural steps. I kept her report ready because competence was a mirror the defense could not break if faces were steady. Each day, I watched them escalate in small increments, emboldened by the visible cameras but unaware of the hidden ones. They accessed my mail, rifled through drawers when they thought I was not looking, and argued about timelines in the pantry at midnight. Because their greed required practical action, they left footprints in the sand that could be followed by anyone who knew how to read tracks. I logged every transgression in my notebook with military precision time written in full, clear description, corroborating exhibit numbers. Documentation felt more like prayer than paperwork. It was the ritual through which justice might be invoked. There were moments of bitter clarity when the cost of this fight struck me. When I watched footage of Christopher hesitating before withdrawing enough cash to cover a betting debt, I remembered the boy who once saved me a piece of his school lunch. Grief and rage combined into a refined purpose rather than a collapse. I wrote to Nicholas daily, concise updates that read like situation reports. Each line was an actionable intel point that would shape the legal assault. Bank freeze, forensic analysis, subpoenas. He responded with calm legalese and dates spelled out. Next Tuesday, we file preservation notices. On this Friday, we request the notary registry. The tempo of the campaign began to match the tempo of my days. On a humid Sunday evening, they tried another tactic. Edith brought over a certificate of my supposed consent to a new power of attorney and demanded I sign it for simplicity. I read it carefully in front of her, feigning lethargy. "This language is confusing," I said slowly, squinting at the fine print. "Better to have the lawyer look at it." Her face hardened at the delay, a flicker of impatience that gave me all the time I needed to photograph the document with a high-resolution camera I kept in my pocket, upload it to my encrypted folder, and note the time in my ledger. She insisted, pressed, then finally left the papers on the table and stormed out. The visible camera recorded her storming off, and the vent recorder captured her muttered curses in a tone that would sound damning in any courtroom. I closed the curtains and labeled the photos folder with the date written out in full. By the end of that week, their audacity grew. The visible cameras had neutered caution, while the hidden recorder collected the truth. I felt like a field commander watching enemy units expose themselves to line of sight. Nicholas called and said the legal team was ready to move once we had one more authenticated audio clip and the bank preservation notices in place. I replied with the single line I had been living by since Mildred's whisper, "Let them believe they are winning." That night, I listened to the recordings until the words blurred, until Edith's voice sounded like a map of intent. I folded my notebook closed and, beneath the silence of my house, wrote one last instruction to myself. Do not confront. Do not provoke. Preserve the evidence until the legal hammer falls. The house felt like a camp at dawn, tense and expectant, and I knew they would make a mistake that would become the final exhibit. The appointment with Dr. Morrison smelled of cheap disinfectant and the quick confidence of a clinic that does not ask many questions. I sat in a waiting room with vinyl chairs and a community bulletin board, and my notebook lay on my knee like a field manual. The sign-in sheet gave a suite number and a temporary phone line that did not match any public registry. When the nurse called my name, she seemed efficient and hurried, the kind of person who moves through territories where time is short and paperwork is currency. The office door had a printed sign taped on that looked recent and a little too neat. Dr. Morrison, General Practice, Temporary Suite. The man who greeted me wore a white coat that fit like borrowed armor and spoke with the hollow speed of someone who fields too many forms. He asked questions in a way that made the answers obsolete. Memory tests were perfunctory, word lists read in a monotone, a clock drawing exercise that he did not bother to watch closely. The evaluation read like a script, not a diagnostic conversation, and when he finished, he printed a note that matched the guardianship language we'd feared: progressive memory loss, signs of confusion, a recommendation for further psychiatric evaluation and family oversight. I kept my face neutral and thanked him. I left with a stamped appointment card and a small, perfunctory report printed on office letterhead. Later, when I called the number on the sign, it went to a forwarding service. When I checked the state registry, Dr. Morrison had no licensing record at that address. The pattern was obvious. A contrived evaluation created to fit a legal narrative. Institutions are vulnerable to corruption when the process becomes routine, because routine offers camouflage. It had become clear that they hoped to use that camouflage to walk into a courtroom with a professional-looking report and a smiling witness to say the words that unmake a life. Incompetence. I took that report to Nicholas, who read it the way a soldier reads an intercepted communique looking for source, for signal, for the honest voice buried in noise. He frowned, then told me the same thing my instincts had already whispered. A forged evaluation is only as strong as the evidence that supports it. We had Mildred's recording, forged signatures, financial trails, and now a fake clinical impression. The plan was to meet fraud with forensic clarity. Nicholas set up a formal chain. We would preserve the forged report, document its anomalies, and counter it with a legitimate assessment by a board-certified professional whose credentials would not be questioned. Dr. Patricia Chen's office was on the second floor of a brick building that smelled of lemon, oil, and leather. the opposite of the temporary suite. She met me in the same calm way a field medic greets a returning squad, steady, experienced, unflappable. Her evaluation was thorough and humane. She tested orientation to date and place with explicit precision, asked for a detailed recount of recent events, measured short-term and long-term memory with structured tasks, and assessed executive function with complex sequencing exercises that required both recall and strategy. The tests were clinical instruments, not theater, and her notes reflected nuance. Notations of how I approached problem solving, the steadiness of my reasoning, the clarity of my timeline. When she finished, she sat back and said simply, "Your assessments show competence. No evidence of progressive cognitive decline. You demonstrate intact executive function and sound memory. From a clinical standpoint, you are able to manage your affairs." She documented everything carefully, printed a report with her full name, license number, and a signature that matched the registry. She explained the testing in plain terms and offered to testify in court if required. Reading her report was like listening to a reliable radio signal amid static. It restored the possibility that the truth could be heard without distortion. But the system had already been primed to accept the first narrative if we did not move quickly. The forged evaluation was a weapon designed to work before the counterargument could be mounted. Nicholas filed immediate preservation notices with the clinic that had hosted Dr. Morrison's temporary suite, requested call logs and visitor records, and placed a preservation subpoena on the registrar that handled notary services in our county. He also arranged for forensic analysis of the document's paper and ink, and for digital metadata extraction from any scanned files. For every forged page, we wanted an expert who could show the chain of fabrication. In parallel, I continued the performance of confusion at home, allowing the conspirators to believe their document had shifted the terrain in their favor. I misremembered a date in front of them, I misplaced my reading glasses where they could find them, and I let my answers slow by a beat. Consciously masking competence made their confidence bolder. Confident criminals are sloppy criminals. Meanwhile, the hidden recorder collected their conversations. Edith practiced the phrasing she imagined would sound professional in court. Christopher whispered about closing the loop and finalizing transfers. They rehearsed their lies and, in the process, revealed more. 2 days after Dr. Morrison's quick assessment, Nicholas notified the bank that we were contesting any changes and requested a ledger of every withdrawal written out in full. He also filed official complaints with the State Medical Board and the Notary Oversight Commission, triggering formal inquiries. Each bureaucratic hammer hit a small piece of their scaffolding. Patience in these processes is a kind of strategy, because official investigations take time and create friction for those who want quick outcomes. They had hoped for speed and silence. Instead, they found delays and scrutiny. The morning the guardianship papers found their way to my front step, I watched the envelope like a soldier watching an enemy courier approach a checkpoint. The petition was detailed: alleged progressive memory loss, numerous incidents of confusion, statements from supposed neighbors, and the forged temporary clinical note attached as support. It was everything they had hoped for, spelled out on paper and signed with the gravity of official procedure. They believed the paperwork would become the story, and the story would become the truth. I stood in my doorway with that petition in my hands and thought of the boy who had once saluted me in a school play, convinced the world was simple and good. That boy had grown into a man who sat on a plane while planning the end of his father for financial gain. I folded the guardianship petition carefully and placed it with my other documents, each labeled and catalogued like the parts of an after-action report. The legal machinery had begun to click, and the fight would now move from quiet surveillance to formal filings in courtrooms where evidence could be weighed and consequences issued. Outside, the afternoon hummed with ordinary life lawnmowers, distant laughter, a mail carrier moving down the street. Inside, my house felt like a command center readying to execute a plan. I updated Nicholas with the new petition details and prepared the next step. They had opened a door into the legal world. They thought they controlled the hallway. I smiled once, a small, soldierly smile, and wrote the next line on my checklist. Expose forged clinical note. Secure testimony from Dr. Patricia Chen. Prepare forensic document examiner. They believed the tide had turned. I believed the war had only shifted into a new front where patience and proof would win the day. The courthouse smelled of paper, polish, and fear, the kind of fear that hides under pressed suits and soft voices. I had walked into battlefields quieter than that waiting room. The preliminary guardianship hearing was set for 10 in the morning on a Tuesday in July. Nicholas sat beside me, sharp in a gray suit, briefcase at his feet, calm as a man who had prepared every detail twice. Across the aisle sat Christopher and Edith, dressed for sympathy. Christopher in a suit too tight at the neck, Edith in muted hospital white, clutching a folder of documents that she believed would define my future. Her confidence was brittle. She avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the stack of papers before her, as though sheer attention could make them true. When the clerk called our case, the judge looked over his glasses with a mixture of politeness and fatigue. Guardianship petition of Francis Wilson. His tone was neutral, his eyes were not. He had read something in those filings that did not sit right. The defense presented first always better for us. Their attorney, a polished man with an expensive watch, began with the practiced compassion of someone who has learned to monetize empathy. "Your Honor, this is not about greed," he said. "It's about care. Our clients are deeply concerned for Mr. Wilson's safety. There have been incidents forgetting to pay bills, confusion about medications, wandering the neighborhood late at night." His words landed with theatrical pauses, designed for effect rather than accuracy. Nicholas rose slowly, legal pad in hand. "Your Honor," he began, his voice even, "every claim in that petition will be addressed with evidence, not emotion." He walked to the bench, handed over the packet. 37 pages of exhibits, each numbered, labeled, and cross-referenced. For every alleged incident, we have documentation proving fabrication. For every claimed medical opinion, we have a licensed professional's report refuting it. He paused just long enough to let the silence sharpen. And for every act of deceit, we have the defendant's own words, recorded and time-stamped. The courtroom grew still. Christopher shifted in his seat. Edith's fingers tightened around her folder until her knuckles turned white. Nicholas called the first witness, Dr. Patricia Chen. She entered the courtroom with the calm of someone who had seen chaos in other forms. Her testimony was methodical. She explained the cognitive tests, the procedures, the results, each phrase anchored by numbers, details, and professional precision. "In my clinical opinion," she concluded, "Mr. Wilson is fully competent. There is no evidence of dementia, no cognitive decline, no incapacity to manage his affairs." Then Nicholas presented the other report, the one from the fake Dr. Morrison. He handed copies to the judge and the opposing counsel, then produced the subpoenaed metadata showing the document had been created 3 days before the alleged evaluation, using a commercial template. The office listed on this report, Nicholas said, was leased temporarily to a shell entity that closed within 48 hours. The phone number is a forwarding service. The name Dr. Morrison is not registered in the state's medical licensing database. In short, this report is a forgery designed to deceive the court. A ripple moved through the courtroom like wind across tall grass. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Clark, do you have corroboration?" Nicholas smiled slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. From the State Medical Board. Their letter confirming the absence of such a license is Exhibit 17. The judge read the letter slowly, then set it aside. Across the aisle, Edith's mask cracked for the first time. She exhaled sharply, color draining from her face. Then came the recordings. Nicholas played the segment captured from the hidden vent recorder, their voices unmistakable. "Edith, get him declared incompetent. Then we control everything. Christopher, what if he fights it? Edith, he won't. He's already halfway gone." Their attorney objected, citing privacy and chain of custody, but Nicholas was ready. "Your Honor, these recordings were obtained from a security system lawfully installed by Mr. Wilson for his protection. Audio authentication and chain of custody documentation are included as Exhibits 22 through 25. The objection was overruled. The judge listened in silence, pen tapping lightly against the bench. I sat still, hands folded on my lap, every heartbeat measured. Watching your child listen to their own voice plotting your erasure is not a feeling language was designed for. The soldier in me focused on breathing, the father in me wanted to look away, but justice requires witnesses. I kept my eyes forward, unflinching. When the recordings ended, Nicholas presented Mildred's video, the one from the airport bathroom. Her voice shook through the speakers, describing the plan, the money, the timeline. The sound of Edith's laughter after saying, "Altitude makes heart attacks plausible," filled the courtroom. Christopher's shoulders sagged as if the sound itself added weight. By the time the video stopped, even their attorney had stopped taking notes. Nicholas closed with quiet precision. "Your Honor, my client spent decades teaching young people about truth, evidence, and accountability. When his own son and daughter-in-law plotted against him, he did what any good teacher would do. He documented. This is not senility. This is strategy. This is survival. He sat down without flourish. The judge adjusted his glasses. Petition for guardianship denied, he said, voice firm. This court will refer all evidence of forgery and fraud to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. His gavel struck once, sharp as a rifle crack. Christopher's head dropped. Edith whispered something I could not hear. The courtroom emptied around us, but I stayed seated for a long moment, hands clasped, feeling the strange silence that follows victory, a silence that does not feel like peace yet, only the pause before the next operation. Nicholas leaned toward me. We've turned defense into offense, he said. Now we build the criminal case. I nodded slowly, my voice calm, deliberate. Then we finished what they started. Outside, sunlight burned against the courthouse steps, bright and unyielding. For the first time in months, I felt the air on my face and thought not of revenge, but of justice patiently earned. The war had changed fronts again, and I was ready. When a battle ends, the smart soldier doesn't celebrate. He reorganizes, reloads, and studies what worked. The hearing was over, the guardianship denied, but for Nicholas and me, it was only phase 2. The next stage wasn't about defense anymore. It was about counterattack. We had to make sure that what my son and his wife had done wasn't just exposed, but punished in a way that would echo in the records, in their reputations, in every institution that had been part of their plan. Nicholas and I met again the next morning in his office. The blinds were half drawn, the air filled with quiet purpose. He laid out 3 binders across the table, each thick with labeled exhibits. One for the district attorney, one for civil litigation, one for my own records. Francis, he said, this is the most complete elder abuse and attempted homicide case I've seen in 20 years. His tone wasn't flattery, it was an assessment. They left us everything: motive, opportunity, documentation, audio evidence, even witnesses. They built their own gallows. He opened the binder, marked criminal proceedings, and went through the sequence like a commander reviewing coordinates. The first section was titled Conspiracy to Commit Murder, supported by Mildred's recording and the transcript certified by an audio analyst. The second, Forgery and Fraud, detailed the forged insurance beneficiary change, the false medical documents, and the financial transfers, each page stamped and authenticated. The third, Elder Financial Exploitation, presented the timeline of thefts, the altered power of attorney, and the guardianship petition supported by fabricated evidence. Each section flowed into the next with narrative precision, designed not to confuse a jury but to lead them step by step through the betrayal. Nicholas spoke slowly, deliberate with every phrase. The prosecutor won't need to build the story, we've done it for them. I'll present this to the DA's office this afternoon, expect formal charges within 2 weeks. He paused, studying me. When this moves forward, there will be media attention. They'll paint you as the victim, and them as the villains, but the camera always wants emotion. Stay disciplined. Speak only through facts. I smiled faintly. You think after 30 years of teaching teenagers I'd forget how to manage a hostile room? He chuckled, then turned serious again. Good, because they'll try to spin it desperation, debt, emotional stress. But this wasn't desperation, Francis. It was calculation. While Nicholas handled the legal terrain, I managed the moral one. I didn't want to hide from the community. So I started small. I visited the neighbors who had signed those false witness statements. I knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door first. She opened it halfway, eyes down. Mr. Wilson, I didn't know what they were doing. Christopher said it was for your safety. Her voice broke on the word safety. I nodded gently. They used your kindness, Margaret. But now you know the truth. Do what's right. She wiped her eyes and promised to testify honestly if called. The same thing happened at 2 other houses: shame, apologies, and the slow healing of trust. Forgiveness wasn't my aim. Truth was. At night, I organized everything at home. My study had turned into a command post folders labeled by color, a calendar with each legal date written in longhand, the vent recorder carefully boxed and sealed for evidence. The table where Christopher once ate dinner now carried the weight of justice. I sat there under the desk lamp, reviewing the chain of evidence and updating my journal, not with bitterness, but with the clarity that only distance can give. A week later, Nicholas called. They filed charges, he said. Attempted murder, forgery, fraud, and elder exploitation. Bail set at $50,000 each. I asked if they were in custody. For now, yes, he replied. Their lawyer is trying for bail reduction, but the DA's pushing back. I didn't ask about their faces or their reactions. Some things you don't need to see. But the next day, The local news carried a small headline on page 4. Couple charged in plot to defraud elderly veteran. It was concise, unemotional, just a summary of legal facts. That was all I wanted. Truth on record. Nicholas and I spent the next few weeks fortifying the case. He arranged meetings with expert witnesses, the forensic document examiner who had traced the ink composition of the forged signatures, the cyber specialist who retrieved deleted emails, and the audio expert who verified the authenticity of the recordings. Each professional signed affidavits. Each added another link to the chain. By the end of the month, the evidence was beyond contestation. But something unexpected happened as the case advanced. I began receiving letters from people I didn't know. Veterans, retired teachers, widows, people who had faced quiet betrayals and lost to silence. They thanked me for fighting, for documenting, for refusing to disappear behind pity. I read each one, carefully folded them, and placed them in a small wooden box beside my medals. It wasn't pride I felt. It was recognition that even private justice has public echoes. Nicholas called again that Friday. The DA wants to offer a plea deal, he said. 5 years, probation, restitution, and public apology. They're willing to return the stolen money. I was silent for a long moment. They wanted me dead, James, I said quietly. They can live with the weight of trial, he sighed. I thought you'd say that. That night, I watched old videos of Christopher as a boy. His laughter in the backyard, his first fishing trip, the day he graduated. Each image was a small death, now proof of something I once believed permanent. I closed the laptop and wrote one final note in my ledger. Justice is not revenge. It is memory restored to truth. Outside, the Florida night buzzed with cicadas. Inside, I felt the stillness that comes when the mission nears completion. The case was ready for court. The traps were all documented. The war was almost over. But wars rarely end cleanly. There's always the last ambush, the final push. And deep down, I knew Christopher wouldn't accept defeat quietly. Something in his eyes that day in court told me he'd try again. One last move, one last gamble. I tightened my jaw, straightened the folders, and wrote another line beneath the last one. Be ready when they break. The first sign that the storm wasn't over came at dawn, 4 days before the trial. The phone on my nightstand buzzed once, then again, vibrating against the wood. Unknown number. I answered with the caution of a man who's seen too many bad surprises start with silence. Mr. Wilson? A voice said, low and strained. It was Mildred, the flight attendant. They came looking for me, she whispered. 2 people. Said they were from legal counsel, but they weren't. I recognized her, your daughter-in-law. She was outside my building last night. I sat up, the sheets cold against my back. Are you safe now? I asked. Yes, but I'm leaving Orlando for a few days. I wanted you to know. She hesitated. They're desperate, Francis. I heard her say something about fixing the witness problem. Please, be careful. When the line went dead, I stayed still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner. This was the moment every veteran knows when the enemy realizes they've lost the legal war and decides to fight dirty. I got out of bed, opened the safe in my study, and pulled out the small handgun I'd kept since service unloaded. Legal, clean. I placed it on the desk beside the phone, not as threat but as symbol, readiness. Then I called Nicholas. He answered immediately, his voice clipped with concern. Francis? I explained what Mildred had said, word for word. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he said, I'll contact the prosecutor's office right now. We'll file for immediate protective orders for both of you. They're out of moves, which makes them dangerous. I heard typing through the receiver, fast and decisive. Lock your doors. Do not confront them if they show up. I'll have officers do a wellness check. After hanging up, I sat in the dark and wrote in my notebook. Desperation reveals character. Beneath it, I drew a single line, straight and even, the kind I used to draw on maps when marking safe routes home. By midday, 2 uniformed deputies came by the house. They were young, polite, almost reverent. One of them recognized me from the local veteran center. We'll do drive-bys every few hours, he said. They won't touch you. I nodded, thanked him, and went back inside. It was strange the same discipline that had kept me alive overseas now kept me calm in my own living room. That night, rain came hard against the windows. I sat in my study watching the security feeds on my laptop. Midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2. At 2:30, movement flickered on the north camera. Headlights. A car idling just beyond the hedges. My heart didn't race. It slowed. Years of training taught my body to move quieter when danger came near. I zoomed in. It was Christopher's sedan. He stepped out, wearing a baseball cap and jacket. Alone. He walked halfway up the driveway, stopped near the porch light. I could see his face now, pale, hollow, eyes glassy from sleeplessness or something stronger. He looked at the house for a long time, then at his phone, as if weighing a decision. The security camera's microphone caught a fragment when he finally spoke under his breath. I just wanted to see it one more time. Then he turned and walked back to the car. I sat there for a long while after he left, staring at the frozen image on the screen. It would be easy to call that moment remorse, but I knew better. Remorse tries to make amends. This was nostalgia for what he'd already destroyed. The next morning, Nicholas called again. Police found tire tracks matching his car near your property. The DA wants to present this as evidence of intimidation. It helps the case. I exhaled slowly. He was here, James. I saw him. There was silence for a moment. He's unraveling, Nicholas said. People like that when control slips, they grasp for something dramatic. The trial was scheduled for Monday, but by Friday afternoon, new developments arrived faster than I could process them. Edith had been fired officially from Silver Palms Medical. Her nursing license suspended, pending investigation. She tried calling me once a blocked number, but left no message. That silence said more than words ever could. Saturday evening, I got another call, this time from a local detective working with Nicholas. Mr. Wilson, he said, we served the restraining order. They've been warned to stay clear. But you should know their lawyer filed an emergency motion for leniency citing mental distress. I almost laughed. Distress, I said? They can explain it to the jury. That night, I prepared for court the same way I'd once prepared for deployment. Suit pressed, documents in order, mind steady. I reviewed my testimony like a soldier reviewing radio protocol exact, concise, unemotional. Every date written out in full, every transfer number memorized, every word deliberate. No anger, no grief. Only truth. Outside. Thunder rolled across the horizon, echoing like distant artillery. I looked at the framed picture on my desk, Christopher at age 7, missing his front tooth, holding a paper flag. You did this to yourself, I whispered, and I'm going to finish it for both of us. I turned off the lights and let the rain drown out the sound of memory. The last line I wrote in my notebook that night was simple. Final push begins Monday, maintain composure. The war ends in daylight. And for the first time since this began, I felt ready to end it not with rage, but with the precision of a man who knows that truth, once released, cannot be stopped. The morning of the trial felt nothing like war, but every sense in my body told me it was. The sky was clear, the air too still, and the courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress I had to take without firing a shot. I woke at 5:30, shaved carefully, pressed my best dark suit, and folded my tie with the precision that 20 years of uniform inspection had beaten into muscle memory. I ate toast without tasting it, poured black coffee, and watched sunlight crawl across the kitchen counter where Christopher once built toy airplanes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had taught him how to build wings. Now I was here to prove he'd tried to cut mine off for cash. Nicholas picked me up at 7:30. Neither of us spoke much. The city was waking up around us, buses, school traffic, coffee shops opening, and yet everything felt unnaturally quiet inside that car. When we arrived, reporters were already outside, microphones poised like weapons. The headline from yesterday's news had spread. Veteran father brings son and daughter-in-law to trial for murder plot. Nicholas guided me through the crowd with calm authority. One hand hovering lightly at my back. Eyes forward, Francis, he murmured. They want your face for their story. Don't give them emotion, give them truth. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was sharp enough to cut air. The prosecutor's table was stacked with binders, evidence packets, photos, and transcripts. Mildred sat quietly in the first row behind them, her face pale but determined. She gave me a small nod when our eyes met. Across the aisle, Christopher and Edith sat side by side, hands folded but not touching. She looked rigid, almost frozen. He looked broken, sleepless eyes, unshaven jaw, movements twitchy, like a man waiting for a sentence he already knew was coming. When the bailiff called order, the judge entered and the jury took their seats. The prosecution began with facts, not drama. This case, the prosecutor said, is about betrayal in its coldest form, premeditated, calculated, and patient. He outlined everything, the forged insurance documents, the bank transfers, the power of attorney, the false medical assessments, and finally, the plan to induce a fatal heart attack at 30,000 feet. No embellishment, no speculation. Just a story too coherent to be coincidence. Nicholas had prepared me to expect the defense to play sympathy. Their lawyer rose, straightened his tie, and started soft. This was never malice, he said. It was desperation, financial hardship, stress, family miscommunication. My clients are remorseful. I watched Christopher's face during that word, remorseful. He flinched slightly, but didn't look up. Edith kept her eyes forward, jaw clenched so tight the tendons showed. The first witness was Mildred. She spoke in a clear, measured voice. I heard the call in the restroom before boarding, she said. The woman was planning to dissolve pills in his drink. She said altitude would make it believable. I recognized her voice later as the defendant, Edith Wilson. Her testimony was steady, unshaken even under cross-examination. When the defense asked if she might have misheard, she replied simply, "You don't forget the sound of someone laughing while describing a death." The courtroom was silent after that. Then came the forensic examiner, who authenticated the signatures, the accountant who traced the stolen funds, the digital expert who recovered the deleted emails, negotiating poison purchases, and finally, Dr. Patricia Chen, who explained that the medical report declaring me incompetent was entirely fabricated. Each witness built another wall around the truth until there was nowhere for lies to breathe. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand slowly, deliberately. I took the oath and sat, spine straight, eyes forward. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Wilson, when did you first realize your family might be trying to harm you?" I answered in full sentences, calm and precise, no hesitation. "The night they offered me the trip to Miami," I said. I saw calculation in their eyes, not care. From that moment I documented everything, because in the service, we learned that truth without proof is just noise. He asked why I'd waited so long to act. "Because they were my blood," I said, "and blood makes fools of smart men. But once you see betrayal clearly, there is no unseeing it." A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. One woman dabbed her eyes. Then came the defense's cross-examination, and they tried to paint me as vindictive, angry, obsessed with documentation. "Mr. Wilson," the lawyer asked, "isn't it true you've been keeping notebooks for decades, even about trivial things?" I looked him dead in the eye. "Yes," I said. "That's what saved my life." The room held its breath. He tried another line. "So you enjoy control, don't you?" I replied. "I enjoy survival." The prosecutor ended with a single closing statement that hit like a rifle shot. Christopher Wilson sold his father's life for $500,000 and then lost his soul trying to collect. When the jury left to deliberate, the silence in that courtroom felt like a vacuum. 78 minutes later, they returned. No eye contact, no hesitation. The foreman stood and read each verdict clearly. Count 1. Conspiracy to commit murder guilty. Count 2. Forgery guilty. Count 3. Fraud guilty. Count 4. Elder financial exploitation guilty. Each word landed like the click of a locking bolt. Edith gasped quietly. Christopher's hands shook on the table. The judge thanked the jury, then turned to them. "Your father's mercy will define how you serve your sentence," he said. He looked at me. "Mr. Wilson, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" I stood. The courtroom waited. I spoke slowly, carefully. For 40 years, I taught young men about history, about cause and consequence. My son forgot those lessons. I don't hate him, but I won't protect him from the truth either. He wanted my life for money. He'll spend years learning the worth of what he tried to take. The judge nodded, then read the sentence. Edith, 5 years imprisonment, professional license revoked permanently. Christopher, 3 years probation, restitution of all stolen funds, and mandatory counseling for gambling addiction. A restraining order, permanent, for both. The gavel came down once. Sharp. Final. When it was over, Christopher looked at me for the first time in months. His mouth opened like he wanted to say sorry, but no sound came. I turned away. Mercy had already been given. I hadn't asked for prison, only truth. That was enough. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Flashbulbs strobed. Voices echoed down the marble steps. Nicholas leaned close. "You did it," he said softly. Justice doesn't always look this clean. I looked up at the bright Florida sky, the one that had nearly been my grave 6 months ago, and felt nothing but quiet relief. "No," I said, "but it's honest." And for the first time since the whisper on that airplane, I could breathe without waiting for betrayal. The mission was complete, but the story, the warning, had just begun. When the noise faded, I returned home to a silence so deep it almost hummed. The trial was over. The verdicts were final. The reporters had moved on to fresher tragedies. The house stood as it had always stood, bookshelves, papers. The faint scent of coffee still clinging to the wood grain of the dining table, but it felt different. Not like a place haunted, but like a battlefield after the smoke clears. Quiet, honest, unforgiving. Nicholas stopped by that evening to deliver the official court copies, stamped verdicts, restitution orders, and the final restraining notice. He placed them neatly on my desk. "This," he said, tapping the papers, "is closure on record." I nodded once. "Closure is a polite word," I said. "Truth feels more like disarmament. You lay down the weapon, but your hands still remember its weight." He smiled faintly. "You're a poet when you're not busy being a soldier." After he left, I made tea and sat at my desk, the same spot where this war began. The evidence boards were gone, the cameras removed, the files boxed and stored in the closet under a single label. Christopher case closed, August 2025. I opened my old leather-bound teaching journal and turned to a blank page. At the top, I wrote, "Final lesson." I wrote slowly, like I used to when preparing lessons for my students. History repeats not because people forget, but because they refuse to believe betrayal can come wearing a familiar face. Beneath that, I added, "Documentation is not obsession, it is defense. Memory is a form of armor. Truth, when recorded carefully, cannot be silenced." Then I closed the book gently, knowing that someday another teacher, or another veteran, or another father might read those words and understand. The weeks that followed were strange in their calmness. The Veteran Center invited me back to speak about resilience and legal awareness for elders. I accepted. The first day, when I stood before the small crowd of retirees, I didn't mention my son by name. I simply said, "If you sense something wrong, write it down. Truth dies when left to memory alone." They nodded, some knowingly, some painfully, and afterward a woman came up to me with tears in her eyes. "You just saved someone's life," she whispered. I hope she was right. The house began to feel like home again. I cooked breakfast without checking over my shoulder. I read books without looking up every few minutes at the door. The cameras were gone, but habit made me glance at corners out of instinct, an old soldier's reflex. Over time, that faded too. Sometimes, late at night, I caught myself staring at the photograph of Christopher at 7 years old, the one I could never throw away. The gapped smile, the paper flag, the sunlight catching in his hair. I never forgave what he did, but I learned to separate the boy from the man who chose greed over grace. I kept that photograph not as nostalgia, but as evidence of love, of loss, of how innocence erodes when left unguarded. In early September, I received a letter from the Educational Futures Foundation, the charity named in my new will. They accepted my donation to fund scholarships for low-income veterans' children. The letter ended with a line that caught me off guard. "Your story inspired the creation of a course on ethics and accountability." I smiled, folded the letter, and placed it next to my journal. Maybe the past still had a purpose. That night, I walked out to the porch. The air was cool, the kind of Florida night that carried faint ocean salt if you stood still long enough. I looked up at the sky, the same one that had nearly been my tomb above Miami, and let myself breathe freely. No more whispers, no more shadows, no more pretending to be sick just to survive. Inside, the clock ticked softly, each second an ordinary miracle. I thought about Mildred somewhere far away, rebuilding her life. About Nicholas, still out there helping strangers find justice. And about myself, sitting in the peace I'd fought for without firing a bullet. I picked up my pen and wrote the final line in my notebook. Neat and steady. Justice delivered. Life reclaimed. Mission complete. Then I closed it, placed it in the drawer, and switched off the lamp. The room fell into quiet darkness, not the kind that hides danger, but the kind that finally lets a man rest.